Order. Welcome to this morning's session of the House of Commons Select Committee on Business and Trade. Today we are taking evidence as part of our inquiry on industrial policy. Thank you so much to our witnesses for joining us. I need to make a very brief declaration of interest in that Dr. Mann Virdee was once employed by my good self in an advisory capacity on our work on the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Dr. Valero, perhaps I could kick off with you. Do you want to just give us a sense, from your point of view, about how the competitive landscape is changing for the UK? We've obviously got quite low rates of economic growth in a world that is actually forecast to grow by 3 and a bit %. So global growth faster than UK growth. But tell us what you think about the competitive challenges that arise.
Great, and thank you very much for having me here today. As you say, there are growth opportunities out there. The UK, on the positive side, the UK has a lot of relevant strengths. I think we'll get into those more in this session. Relevant comparative advantages in areas that are growing and are forecast to grow globally. The reality is, though, for some time we've seen this weak productivity performance and weak investment performance. So these are concerning as other countries are really ploughing ahead with drives to get public sector, private sector investment up and to capture quite purposefully some of the opportunities of the future, whether it's clean technologies, digital technologies, AI. We have lots of strengths in those areas. We have various initiatives to try and get... Just
list the strengths for us. So if you were to sort of pick the top sort of, I don't know, three or four strengths, what would you pick?
We're fundamentally, the word superpower is used. We're a services superpower because we are a major exporter of services and we're also highly specialised in services. So specialisation, as measured by comparative advantage, is you take your share of your own exports in a particular area and compare that to the global share. So we're specialised in services.
Services superpower, yeah.
But within that, it's not just finance, it's also professional and business services, it's creative sectors, it's design, consulting, and so it's quite broad-based. But on top of that, we're specialised in areas of manufacturing, so things like aircraft, things like pharmaceuticals within the life sciences, and things like beverages as well.
Yeah.
Now, what I've just said is based on aggregations that we can look at over time across countries. And of course, there's always the danger then that you're missing more detailed categories where we're also specialised.
Before we go there, though, can we just take... So let's take those kind of three competitive strengths, if you like. How is the global competitive landscape now changing in a way that is going to affect those strengths? What do we need to be worried about unfolding in the world?
Well, take manufacturing, obviously the Inflation Reduction Act, the EU's response, and China's kind of doubling down on clean technologies. There's a lot going on out there, and if we're not doing something a little bit more purposeful in that space, we risk losing out on investment in the UK. It's not that we can specialise in all the clean technologies of the future, but we actually do have underlying strengths that we can build on. If you take manufacturing, high-value manufacturing more generally, we know that manufacturing is an area of trade that has suffered since Brexit, and it's really important for us to be close on regulatory and other areas with Europe when it comes to manufacturing. Otherwise, some of the analysis suggests that what might happen is our manufacturing base might be at risk of moving to less high-value add areas.
So the peril, if you like, is big state policy from other big players, Beijing, Bidenomics, Brussels, but we've also got some peril from the fact that we're no longer part of this great big single integrated market.
Yes, I think so. And of course, services, even pre-Brexit, a lot of our services trade went outside of the EU, and that's where there's scope to make more ambitious service trade agreements with further afield countries. However, I would say another peril is actually more like human capital and skills. So other countries, it's not just that they have these industrial strategies or investment programs. Other countries are also improving their human capital, their universities. Universities underlie a lot of our strengths in terms of the skills that we provide, the excellence going on in our universities in teaching and in R&D. But other countries are investing more in that and getting more competitive. So if you think about services, if you think of high-value manufacturing and innovative activities in general, a lot of that does rely on high-quality human capital, either that we produce here or that we're able to attract from overseas.
Okay. Raoul, would you add anything to the list of challenges?
No, I think the list of challenges is correct. I think maybe just framing it, I would add that there are a number of trends going on in terms of the shift away from the rules-based international order, a move to a kind of more bipolar or multipolar world, and a shift away from reliance on kind of efficiency within supply chains to greater focus on resilience, and that also ties into the energy transition. So those kind of four trends underpin some of this shift. So I do think that context is important, and I think that is relevant then when thinking about the tools and how you react. So I agree with a lot of what Anna said. I think, though, when we look at how we can start to adapt to this, it does mean the pressure on traditional forms of using kind of international organisations, using trade defences and other rules within those organisations, or trying to strike free trade agreements to deepen ties, have become more complicated and aren't necessarily a priority for some of our partners. And I think if you look at kind of the approach taken in the US, China and the EU, yes, there are opportunities for cooperation, but my sense is that cooperation isn't necessarily top of their mind. And so we do also have to look at what we can do individually in developing our own industrial sector strategy, thinking about the strengths that Anna mentioned and areas we can build on, and be quite clear about where we want to try and compete and how we can compete in those areas.
Dr. Virdee, anything to add to the perils that we now confront?
I think just on the strengths and weaknesses of the UK's science and tech ecosystem. Obviously, quantum and life sciences are two of the strengths, but it's important to note that the UK may not actually be as world-leading as we like to think, because when you look at institutions such as DeepMind and the MRC lab of molecular biology, these are actually outliers, and so once they're removed from the statistics, actually the UK performs more weakly than when they are in.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Great. Andy MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. Perhaps I could ask Raoul this question, because I think we've heard from Anna to some degree about this. But what's your take? What do you mean by, what should we take about comparative advantage? What does it mean?
Well, I think Anna well set out the textbook definition, and that's an important part of it. I think we should also look, though, beyond just our trade advantages and think about our research and maybe patent advantages. So, for example, if you look at our kind of what's called our revealed comparative advantage in patents, so where we produce relatively more patents than compared to some other countries, I think we see in areas like chemistry, biotech, medtech, consumer goods, civil engineering, engines and transport. The UK has a relative comparative advantage there, so we produce more patents than we would be expected to compared to other countries, and so I think we're quite good at churning out those ideas. And so I think that's an important context when thinking of our advantage. It isn't just about where we are necessarily doing well in trade terms, but thinking down the line where we produce good R&D, where we produce a number of patents. And I think importantly, one of the things that we are probably less good at in this country is taking those ideas and commercialising them and scaling up companies off the back of it. So I think we should take quite a broad view of our comparative advantage and look beyond just trade and think about those sort of areas. I think we also have to think about a couple of other factors. One is where demand or supply will be globally. So, for example, if you look at the expected, I think the International Energy Agency has set out that the expected supply in areas such as battery and solar is probably going to meet demand up to 2030, but less so in areas like wind and heat pumps. And then we also think about some of the global megatrends and how things are changing globally, a rising middle class in emerging markets, a rising demand for services. I think between those things, our own comparative advantage in trade, comparative advantage in research and development and ideas, and then also some of the global trends we see, I think you can start to triangulate areas where the UK should seek to compete and where we might have an advantage.
And you touched upon this worrying departure from the rules-based system. So it's a pretty sort of scary world to a very large degree. So how do you, looking at that broad scene of these advantages that we may have, where do you think are the pinch points in terms of our strategic advantages in these key areas that might be upset by the abandonment of the rules-based system?
Well, starting at quite a high level, right, I think the UK is unlikely to compete on money and scale with the likes of US, China, EU in terms of the size of their market and the money they're putting behind some of these sectors. So I think we have to be quite clever about how we position ourselves. And then if we start to look at some of the strengths we talked about, they are particularly in areas that are probably more upstream in technologies and industries, so research and development, innovation, intellectual property, and obviously we have our long-standing skills within our universities and our research institutes. So I think we could look to be an area of innovation, of development. We probably won't be the market of scale and large-scale deployment for some of these industries and some of these sectors, but focusing upstream is something that we can do and start to think about. I think then you also have to look at sort of where money and investment is flowing in these economies and think about the opportunities that gives to us. So, for example, what we've seen off the back of the US Inflation Reduction Act is a huge increase in their imports of EVs from South Korea and the EU, for example. So we shouldn't just view these issues as a negative, but also an opportunity for there might be markets created that we can export into. And then finally, I think we have to think about a lot of non-financial incentives as well as just the financial incentives. I think when we talk about industrial and sector strategy, we get very hung up on how big the subsidies will be, what the tax credits might be. But I think when we speak to businesses, we hear a lot about actually the more non-financial side and the ease of doing business and the ease of innovating. So, for example, changing the way we regulate certain industries. We have a very us versus them approach to regulation. The market innovates and then regulators look at things after they've been innovated and take their time to regulate them. I think that approach is becoming increasingly difficult in a very competitive world and a quite distorted landscape. And so looking at more how regulators and the market can work together when it comes to innovation is important. And then things like making it easier for trials and testing and bringing products to market in the UK if we are going to target that kind of innovation upstream development space.
Anna, let's bring you in here. But given everything that Raoul said, in my mind, I'm thinking about the resilience question in terms of this country functioning so that it isn't under threat. We've seen it with so many different, major crises in the world that there's been quite a lot of exposure.
I think resilience is a key reason that we need to have a strategic approach. What are the areas we're good at that are also growing, that are quite large, clean technologies, AI, other things. But now we've got additional resilience concerns because we've seen a pandemic where we could have been more resilient, an energy crisis when we could have been more resilient, and various geopolitical risks too. So that begs the question, which are the key supply chains that you need to have some capability on rather than entirely rely on importing? What are the connections between supply chains? So, for example, if we want to have a car industry, we need battery manufacturing. Battery manufacturing or the innovation alongside it isn't necessarily one of our comparative advantages currently, but there's generally an acceptance that we need that capability here in the UK. Also, it's to do with understanding things. So if you think about it this way, even if we do have world-leading activities, research, innovation to do with AI, but if we don't maintain that to some extent, it'll be much harder for us to understand developments, respond to them when it comes to things like cybersecurity or other regulatory challenges. So it's complex, but I think resilience and security have now become quite embedded in the considerations. So there's the growth, comparative advantage in growing areas. So it's not just comparative advantage in an area that might be tiny and is likely to continue to be tiny. That won't necessarily get you growth. But if it's a large area and it's projected to grow and you're good at it, that's a good way to focus things from a growth perspective. But now also these resilience with lots of different aspects, I think are really crucial as well.
Thank you. Dr. Virdee, can I come on to you, perhaps tie this in to some degree with, yes, about tying in those competitive advantages with broader strategic ambitions, but the role of government. Can I ask you just to address this? How can governments target areas of comparative advantage effectively, and are they effective in their measures?
There are a number of things government can do, and one is to be a better customer. So I'm leading a study at the Council on Geostrategy on the strengths and weaknesses of the UK's science and tech ecosystem, and particularly on net zero. And the study is still ongoing, so I'm only able to present preliminary findings now. But one thing that innovators and scientists and policymakers and policy researchers tell me is that the government can be a better customer. So not just to act as a regulator, but to leverage its significant buying power and invest in innovative products such as semiconductors, and also perhaps offer incentives to businesses that support SMEs. There could also be a commission. The government could also commission a cross-departmental review of how it uses public sector procurement as a tool to support cutting-edge science and technology. And we've seen this happen before in other places. We know this kind of thing does work. And Silicon Valley is an example that people often talk about. It's something that's quite hard to replicate. But part of the success of Silicon Valley has come through government support, and particularly through military contracts. And during the Cold War, Santa Clara County, for example, received almost $5 billion a year in military contracts, and it went on to develop high-tech sort of microelectronics and other weapon systems, such as used in the F-16, and that had spillover effects for the wider region. Silicon Valley was eventually able to provide some of the electronics for the Apollo program, and it's really that kind of ecosystem that was developed during that period.
On the business of, you're saying being a better customer, that's really helpful. But are we any good at identifying the existing areas of competitive advantage now? Being a better customer for whatever might be out there is all well and good. But are we good at identifying those areas and supporting them appropriately?
I don't think we are, and I think part of the reason for that is there's a lack of technical expertise within government, and that's something certainly that does need to be improved.
Yeah. So in terms of that shift in direction, so are you basically saying that within the architecture of government we need to have long-term specialists embedded into the architecture? Is that part of it, or is there anything else that we should be doing?
I believe that's one of the things we do need to be doing, but also the salaries being offered for these type of roles currently, I believe, are not high enough to attract the sort of expertise that's really needed.
Yeah. Would anybody else like to comment upon this? It's something we come across quite regularly, that there seems to be a mismatch of arms, as it were, in terms of those who are trying to steer the thing, opposite those in the commercial world who just take advantage of. So is there anything in that space that we could better develop?
So definitely, I think I'd agree the need to build up skills in the civil service, and I think we don't want to get into civil service reform, but obviously the ability for people to develop as experts within civil service and progress just as an expert within a single line of work is quite difficult. So thinking about how that can be made easier at the moment to progress within civil service, you tend to have to move across a number of different roles, and you don't develop deep expertise. I think there are other things that we should look at. I think you're right that we're not good at identifying our strengths. If you look, for example, pharmaceuticals and automotive have traditionally been quite good in the UK and some of our strengths, but they have dwindled in recent years, and part of that is a Brexit effect, but it is a long-term effect as well. If you look, for example, with our pharmaceutical and chemicals trade with the US, we have significantly underperformed pretty much all of our peers over the past 15 years. And I think in certain pharmaceutical and chemical products, our trade has barely increased over the past 15 years. So, as you say, better targeting and protecting those areas of strength and really being focused on how we can maintain those. And then I think having a better and clearer view of one of the levers that we have and what we're deploying and how. So, we tend to see 4 key levers across government action in this space: kind of governance, which is directions and frameworks and is not legally binding but can help. Regulation, which is legally binding, so setting standards, providing regulatory sandboxes or frameworks for developing innovations. Subsidies, both direct subsidies or direct investment, but also indirect in the form of kind of loan guarantees and underwriting. And then also taxation, one in the form of tax credits and those kinds of incentives, but also taxation to drive activity, so for example a carbon tax or a carbon border mechanism. And so I don't think we have a clear sense of the levers we have and how they're being deployed across certain industries and sectors to achieve the outcomes we want. And so I think we could do much better with that. And then finally, I think we also need to do a better job of connecting the kind of causes and consequences across government. So, for example, I think the Department for Business and Trade is obviously has a number of the key stakeholders in industry in it, but it doesn't control all the levers when it comes to things within what I've mentioned. So obviously subsidies and taxes will be much more controlled out of the Treasury, and so that disconnect between controlling the levers and controlling the relationships and understanding the sectors or understanding the consequences, I think, is also a challenge within government.
Anna, do you want to add anything to that?
I could just add very quickly. So we have made recommendations that we need a growth and productivity institution in the UK, which would be a body of long-term expertise, but also coordinating different bodies across the landscape that already exist and are working on things that matter for growth. So this kind of an institution, I think, would work when we're talking about innovation and our strengths, would work with lots of the specialist bodies or sector bodies or research institutes that really have the in-depth knowledge of specific areas. But what's really important is that we do have a holistic understanding of the types of metrics that guide decision-making. So we mentioned trade data, we mentioned patents data. Both of those have their strengths and weaknesses, but often if you just rely on those, you won't capture things because not all innovation is patented. For example, there are lots of high-growth firms accessing venture capital. Some of them might not have a patent, but they still have an innovation with high growth potential. So the way we've approached this in some of our work on clean technologies and strengths is we've done general analyses of the trade, of the patents, and by the way, on manufacturing trade, there are many products, about 40% of products that are classified as green, where we do have comparative advantage. But we've complemented that with then, we call it a deep dive approach, where you go and talk to experts on a particular technology and on a sector and get more of a holistic view of where the strengths are in the UK, what are different data sets to shed light on that. But importantly, I think this speaks to what Raoul was saying, what are the market failures? In some cases, perhaps the market's working fine. In other cases, because we know that speed matters for net zero and speed matters when we're talking about competition with other countries, maybe the market left to its own devices won't get us there fast enough. Maybe it's because of R&D spillovers, a key kind of market failure that justifies innovation support. Maybe it's financial market constraints. We know that they particularly hold for clean technologies. So a really clear understanding of where the strengths are, what matters based on our growth potential, the resilience we talked about before, and then what actually are the appropriate levers to try and encourage those areas.
Anthony Mackey.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Valero, your point about creating a body or a new institution, why not use something that's already in existence, like the Board of Trade?
So we wrote this report with Bart van Ark at Productivity Institute last November, and what we did was we reviewed a number of other countries in the OECD that have specialist productivity institutions, and then we looked at other areas of economic policy in the UK, and we found that growth and productivity, we stand out for not having an institution. We had the Industrial Strategy Council, it wasn't fully independent, and it doesn't exist now. So we stand out versus other countries, but also growth and productivity stands out in the UK for not having a dedicated institution. We have many institutions, as you say, that will work on relevant pieces of this, but because productivity fundamentally is driven by investment in innovation, infrastructure and skills across the country, with sectoral elements like we've been discussing, with horizontal elements too, and because it's a long-term challenge that needs long-term policy and commitment and evaluation, we felt that there is a strong case for strengthening the institutions in this area if we actually want to begin to move beyond political cycles to a more long-term approach.
Old argument in front of a group of politicians, but yeah, I understand where you're coming from. You started off in your opening remarks about talking about, you know, the high growth areas we're in. The Chancellor spends a great deal of time talking about the sort of $1 trillion industries. How realistic is he on this? And can I also ask whether or not you have a view as to whether or not the UK sector in these high growth areas is growing because we're on America's coattails, or because actually supply chains are diverging so far from the norms of what we've become so very used to? So I would say people may be shying away from China to a degree and then looking to diversify. Are our sectors growing, or are we just following in the wake of others?
Well, in the analysis we've done on sectors, which I would say, you know, the strengths that we've found in the data, they correspond quite well with Jeremy Hunt's 5 sectors, things like digital, green industries, life sciences, where we're very innovative, and advanced manufacturing, creative industries, an area of services. A lot of the analysis we did when we published our report Enduring Strengths of the Economy 2030 inquiry, the data finished in 2019 at that point, the kind of consistent time series we're able to use. So, you know, those strengths were based on data up to 2019, and they were enduring strengths really that we've seen for some time. And it's not just us. The persistence of your comparative advantages is something we see in many other advanced economies.
But those
too.
5 sectors are basically right.
Well, I would say that they're not including professional and business services and finance. Mm-hmm. I would say that they are areas of strength, both on the innovation side that we can see more in patents, say with green industries, and what we can already see in trade, areas of manufacturing and creative industries. But what we do need in terms of scale and where our plausible growth can come from is the professional and business services, including finance. These are large employers across the country. They're well-paid jobs. Yep. We've done some other analysis for the Economy 2030 inquiry where we said, okay, if we have these strategic strengths, what does that mean for skills? What does it mean for workers in those sectors? And we find that actually those sectors pay well at all levels of education. So it's not just favouring the most highly educated. The highly educated earn a premium, but all levels of education do well in those sectors too.
No, guys, thank you for interrupting. So, I mean, then how do we take advantage of this? You know, you're saying it's more than the 5. In fact, the Chancellor's actually underplaying it. He should be talking about 10, perhaps. How do we take advantage on the global stage in terms of these comparative advantages?
I think part of it would be a clear signal of a kind of industrial strategy with longevity that is based on what we are actually good at, what we can plausibly be good at. So the kind of discussion we're having here, rather than having lots of collections of technologies and sectors that the UK is supporting, embed that into a framework. I would say actually the Greg Clark, Theresa May industrial strategy began to do something like that because it had a combination of technologies, grand challenges, which are missions where we also have strengths. It had sector deals, but it also had quite a focus on the horizontal aspect. So we know that actually a lot of our problems in terms of boosting investment, they're issues that are across all areas. Of course, they will impact different areas in different ways. I mean, if you look at capital allowances that were made permanent in the autumn statement, this is a policy to encourage investment. It will, of course, favour more capital-intensive industries more than others. So in some sense, it has an industrial policy angle as a horizontal. But I think that kind of approach, combining, this is the kind of thing that a growth and productivity institution could help to shape, monitor, evaluate.
You have a framework. I think I note if you go onto the government website relating to the 2017 Industrial Strategy Report, it's under the heading of archived. So I don't know what you want to make of that, but I just I kind of want to ask you, what are the risks then that we're sort of seeing with these businesses that are exporting, and how much should government be stepping in to try and protect them? How much should government be trying to sort of factor in some of the risks that have already been mentioned by Mr. Ruparel?
Well, I don't think as a small, what we consider in economics, a small open economy or a small medium-sized open economy, that we should really be thinking about pursuing a protectionist kind of direction. But what we can do is have well-designed policies to encourage investment when we know there are market failures. So it might be providing stability, it might be regulatory, it might be tax incentives. There are, if you look at the budget, there were various tax incentives for the creative industries. We're not using that kind of enhancement as much as we could, particularly when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which has not just the fact that it's got these very generous tax credits, but it's the fact they're enhanced in various ways to try and get various objectives.
Thank you, because you brought me on to this point about the IRA and then also about what we've done in free ports and economic zones and all of this side of things. I mean, do you think we just need more of that? We need more incentivisation, we need more free ports, we need more areas of lower taxation with greater sort of opportunities for export?
I think we need to be careful when you get the spatial elements, whether you're doing something that is additional in the end from the national perspective or moving things around. So I think when we're talking about the UK's growth, we have to have in mind the national perspective. So things like if you're talking about innovation clusters, you've got to have Oxford and Cambridge and London, the Golden Triangle, as core to a global story. If you look at the World Intellectual Property Organization's Global Innovation Index, they have a measure of innovation clusters, and Cambridge and Oxford are in the global top 3, so they have to be core to our national story. Of course, then it comes to levelling up or addressing regional disparities. So then I think, of course, there might be some displacement when you pursue those policies, but try and maximise the additionality and really realising underlying strengths which are spread across the country, particularly in clean technologies. So while we know the Golden Triangle has a lot of our innovation, when you look at things like green technologies, areas outside of the Golden Triangle are more specialised in those things, basically due to, previous sectoral endowments, natural characteristics of places. Think about where offshore wind is or CCUS opportunities. So there's a lot of opportunities pursuing something that could be good for the UK as a whole in the regions as well.
Mr. Ruparel, can I bring you in? Because you obviously had a hand in the industrial strategy in 2017, and I just wonder, to the point that Dr. Valero has just made around where we can enhance, where we can support businesses. Do you want to add any of your sort of thoughts and views as to where UK government should step in and be supportive and helpful to the sectors that we seem to be doing well in?
Yeah, so I think two things I'd add. I think obviously we do need to do some sector-specific stuff, and Dr. Valero set that out very well. I think there is also a structural reform bit across the piece here. And so if you look at why aren't businesses investing, and why is business investment essentially flatlined in the past sort of 6 or 7 years, if not longer, in the UK. And I think it's not a coincidence that also business returns have largely flatlined during that period as well, right? So I think a lot of businesses just don't see the returns on investment they'd like to see in the UK. And so we need to start to unpack why that is. And I think it comes down to some of the fundamental inputs and the cost of inputs for businesses. So if we think about energy, so if you look at industrial electricity prices from the mid-80s to the early 2000s, they were broadly stable in real terms. They then doubled over the next 10 years, and then over the last 10 years they've tripled again. And while the UK isn't alone in the recent spike in energy prices, that long-term trend is quite different to some of our peers. So we have a structurally high energy cost there. When you look at our labour market, we've talked about some of the acute skill shortages in certain sectors, and particularly when you start to think about the energy transition, the requirement for certain skills, whether that's something like welding or knowledge of kind of project management across the supply chain, you're going to see shortages because there are lots of demands across the piece for very similar types of skills. I think on capital, we generally have a very large, deep capital pools, but there are certain areas where we lack that. So I mentioned earlier, obviously, the scale-up funding and the diversity of funding and converting ideas into commercial entities, and then also diffusion of best practice across sectors and across regions. So at a whole, our productivity, we are 10 to 15% in terms of productivity below peers like France and Germany. But we have some firms that are up there with any of the best in the world. The problem is we have a very wide range of productivity, both within sectors and within firms in a sector, and also across regions. So spreading that best practice and improving that productivity. So that's the first point I would say. I think we do need this sector focus, but we also need some fundamental underlying structural reform in these inputs for business.
You're being quite broad about your points here, and I accept that. But we've had many iterations of industrial strategies over the years. It's quite difficult to see whether or not there's been any sort of long-term success on the back of these. In specific cases where there are industries and sectors that are doing really well, should the government be tailored and focused on those specific sectors and really helping them, rather than trying to take a broad brush approach?
Should we lean into the success, basically?
Yeah, I think we have to. I think there are areas, as I said, where we were previously successful, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, automotive, that have dropped off in recent years because we haven't lent in and because we haven't been sufficiently supportive of the industries, and we haven't taken that long-term view on how to develop them going forward. So automotive, obvious in terms of our development of batteries and EV tech. We were quite good at developing the early ideas and patents, and a lot of them came out of British universities, but we didn't commercialise that, we didn't bring it into industry, and we didn't have a long-term strategy to compete there. Similarly, pharmaceuticals and the change in demand in terms of certain pharmaceutical products or change in demand in certain chemical products, we have not invested and developed that over time, and I think we rested on our laurels a bit. So yes, I do think we need to lean in even in areas where we have strength. We also, as we've said, need to think about long-term future opportunities and emerging technologies where there are trends globally and demand globally that we can tap into.
Okay, I'm going to speed up a bit. Ian Lavery.
Thanks, Chair. So look at the positive side of the advantages in the global market, Mr. Ruparel. Do you think you could give some examples of where the UK has lost its advantages in the global market?
Give some more examples where we've lost our advantage.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think the ones I mentioned already are the primary ones in terms of losing ground on pharmaceuticals, chemicals, automotive. I think particularly trade with the US has been quite stark. If you look at the post-COVID and post-pandemic boom in the US, there was a huge boost to trade, particularly in certain goods and certain products, and the UK has missed out on that, and some of that is because we don't necessarily produce those goods, whether it's finished consumer goods or electronics, but even in areas where we were traditionally strong, like automotives, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, we have not been able to take advantage of that for various reasons that I touched upon, but I think particularly a lack of investment into those sectors and long-term strategies. So I do think there are areas where we do need to lean in and protect those strengths. On the whole, the story on services is different, right? I think we have seen our services services trade continue to grow very quickly and outstrip our goods trade growth, particularly post-pandemic. We've been quite good at protecting our strengths in those sectors. Whether that was a conscious or accidental thing, I don't know, but I think it's worth examining why that's been the case.
Mr. Virdee, Dr. Virdee?
Well, one thing I'll just add to that, and it builds on what my two fellow panellists just spoke about, is that industrial policy requires discipline in terms of monitoring, evaluating, and learning about what works, because I think successful industrial policy is not really about picking winners, it's about learning when to let losers go.
I would agree with that, and our analysis has shown, actually, I think, backing up what Raoul said, things like ICT, that's an area where just in the latest data we looked at, it's within services, kind of communications technologies, and that's an area where we lost competitiveness. But of course, within that, you can think of all the digital and the tech startups we have. So this is an area we should be trying to protect. Pharmaceuticals, another area where we've seen a decline in our comparative advantage. Areas that we used to be kind of specialised in and not so much anymore. So if you look at the top 10 products that we were specialised in the past, one of them that we're not anymore, for example, is power generating machinery. So areas of kind of manufacturing strengths from the past we're not necessarily specialised in, but as I said, there are areas of manufacturing, and also when you look at green products, there are areas that we do still have specialisation. I would agree that you've got to learn lessons. It's notoriously hard to evaluate industrial policies, but we need to do better at trying to build up that evidence base, recognise some mistakes will be made, particularly because how we do in these areas doesn't just depend on what we do in this country, but also on what other countries are doing.
Dr. Valero, you're saying that we could have done better. What do you think policymakers possibly could have done to prevent the loss of this competitive edge in the sectors which each of the panelists mentioned?
Well, I think for some time we've got various issues that prevent business investment in the UK, and this is something that Raoul just mentioned. But if you really study what's been preventing businesses investing, and that's what underlies, why are we not investing in things that we could be better at? Why are we not investing in adopting technologies that make us more efficient? There are a number of things. Of course, a lot of discussion is around recent uncertainty. We've been through lots of shocks. We've had policy uncertainty as well, but there are various underlying things too. The constraints in our planning system, those don't just prevent infrastructure being built where it should be built, they prevent housing, which then prevents the effective functioning of labour markets. They prevent things like lab space being built out in the areas where we know are very innovative clusters, so Cambridge being a key example of that. Data centres being built, so planning being a key barrier to all sorts of development. Pensions being a source of deep capital, which exited UK equities, has a particularly low share of of equities, and within that UK equities, but also non-listed assets, so productive assets. So the types of reforms we're seeing now to try and get pensions, UK pensions, into productive investments in the UK. This isn't only important for the kind of scale-up phase of unlisted firms, for example. It's also important for having engaged ownership of larger firms, where we see, if we look at listed firms, they have very dispersed ownership. And there's a whole literature in economics linking engaged ownership with more long-termism and investment and long-term value creation in firms. So there's also issues in our tax system. Lots of change over time makes it harder to plan. We've made positive strides there in terms of capital allowances, business support, a complex landscape. It's hard to get firms to sign up to business support programs, but we know there are firms out there that do want to adopt new innovations and processes that face various barriers to doing so. And then finally, skills. We've mentioned it. We do well at the higher end of skills, but there are still shortages in some areas. Technical vocational education, that's an area we don't do particularly well. Our analysis suggests that lots of the jobs in our strategic sectors could be done with sub-degree qualified people.
Just speed you up because we are rapidly running out of time.
And just finally, I mean, that's obviously you give a lot of facts here. I mean, the question really is, could the policymakers have prevented the loss of the competitive edge in the global markets? I'm really trying to get to the bottom of the policymakers. Could they have made a big difference? Did they make a difference? Should they have done one thing or should they have done another? Or they're like absolutely 100% in the right place?
There are areas, I think, where we've had these problems for really quite a long time, and I think we could have made progress on some of these areas. And in some areas, progress is being made. It's just that it takes time to evaluate and actually see an impact on productivity.
The policymakers being fine with this? Was
I
there
think
any blame that can be focused on the lack of the competitive edge, where we've lost the competitive edge in the previously mentioned sectors, which have been mentioned by each of the panellists?
Well, of course, we have gone through a process of Brexit, which, say, take the pharmaceuticals industry. That leads to a lot of regulatory duplication and complexity. So there are things that we can actually say in the more recent period have damaged our competitiveness. There are other processes through which a more purposeful approach could have enabled us to maintain competitiveness, maybe getting the right skills in place, enabling businesses to invest where they wanted to make investments, where we could have prevented that loss of competitiveness.
There are some sins of omission and sins of commission, by the sound of it. Okay, you happy?
You still really haven't answered the question. Perhaps Dr. Virdee might, or perhaps Mr. Ruparel might. Could policymakers have made a difference?
I mean, I think yes.
It's a simple question, you know. Really.
Yeah, I think if you look in the past where things have made a difference. So, for example, on services in the late 80s and early 90s, we were well behind the productivity frontier in services, and we took a regulatory approach that really promoted financial services and services, and we saw very rapid catch-up. So that was a policy-driven change, and so policymakers can have an effect. If you look again, what's happening at the moment in the US under the IRA, that is a very concerted policy-driven change, and manufacturing manufacturing construction has risen, I think, 90% since August 2022 when the US IRA was introduced. So a policy-driven effect. So policy can have a difference. That being said, it is hard to understand some of these very large changes while they're happening. And so we have the benefit of hindsight now, looking back, and it seems obvious to us. But yes, I do think policy interventions can make a difference in this space. And I think we have seen enough now happen that we can understand what we need to start doing going forward.
I don't have anything further to add to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Can I just move on to services now and look at that specifically? Obviously, the UK is still a big player in terms of services globally, second largest exporter behind the US. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of the UK's strengths in services at the moment? Dr. Valero?
Well, an advantage of that is that services have been growing. They're a large area of global trade and they're predicted to continue growing. So this is a strength that has generated growth for us and can plausibly continue to do so at scale. The other thing is that when we look at the types of jobs in these sectors, they are generally well-paid jobs, as I mentioned before, at different levels of education. I think it's not just finance. That's the key thing. Even in the years up to the financial crisis, our growth was also in professional and business services more generally, and the creative sectors are a key source of strength too. And this is, artists and creative content originators, etc. So that having services strengths is not a bad thing in today's world. France is also quite specialised in services. However, we do have these strengths in high-value manufacturing, and I think because of the resilience concerns that are increasing and in a more potentially fragmented global trading environment, there is more recognition now that we should actually maintain and build various manufacturing capabilities in key supply chains, not least because some of that is important for our energy security, and energy security determines the security of the overall economy.
Right. So would you say that the service sector is still a valuable contributor, though, and how, if it is, then how do we develop that, and what would an industrial strategy for the service sector actually look like? What other things could we be doing just now that would be helpful in terms of spreading the wealth across the rest of the UK as well, and not just, you mentioned as well about the Golden Triangle, but what else can we be doing in terms of supporting the service sector throughout?
Yeah, well, a lot of it will be about skills and people, and actually some of the work in the Economy 2030 inquiry looked at what do plausible growth strategies for big cities outside of London look like, and the argument made there was that services, tradable services, are a plausible route because big cities already have some specialisms in those things. It's something that can be built up more if you encourage homegrown skills and attractiveness to skilled people coming and working in cities, accompanied with more investment, housing, infrastructure, improving the functioning of the local labour market. So it's not that our strength in services is only going to boost London and the South East. It's a plausible route to growth in other parts of the country too, particularly these high-value add tradable services. And so when you're thinking then about the policies on top of skills, it's going to be things like technology adoption, it's going to be things like having trading relationships that are expansive on services, things like regulatory alignment, recognition of qualifications and expertise internationally.
Okay. Any other panellists want to comment on that as well?
I mean, I agree with all that. A couple of things I would add. One on the regulatory side and making sure that the regulators in this space have the right resources and can move quickly to ensure innovation happens within the services sector. I think that's as true in services as it is in manufacturing goods. So that's one. I do think some of the fundamental inputs as well that I mentioned, whether it's energy costs, that is still relevant. We see when we do surveys of businesses that energy costs for services sectors are still a problem. And then also, I think the capital pool, so making sure we're supporting services innovation that's coming out of universities, whether that's through the technology transfer offices or diverse funding pools, to make sure that we have the ability to scale up those businesses here rather than going to seek investment from the US or somewhere else.
Okay. So Virdee, anything to add?
No, I think that's pretty much covered it, I think.
Okay. I noticed that in terms of, I'm quite interested in development of the economy out with the UK, out with the London and South East, because it's, it just seems to be so unbalanced. But I noticed in Scotland we've got the European Cluster for Excellence and Accreditation into FinTech. So in the absence of a long-term industrial strategy, is this what we're going to see in terms of almost like, I'll not say it's piecemeal, but I mean, we're relying on different initiatives across the rest of the country actually to lift the economy in these areas. So is that something that we should be thinking more of, or would an overarching long-term industrial strategy be the answer to actually looking at the whole picture rather than trying to put sticking plasters on things and try and build up the economy like that? Again,
I think
start with yourself, or yeah.
I think coherence is really important, and actually it needs needs clarity and stability across the whole of the UK, and rather than, as you described it, a piecemeal approach for different parts. One thing that the UK really needs to do is to just be sending a clear signal to investors and businesses and partners about what the UK's priorities are, and that it does have a coherent plan and vision across the whole of the UK, rather than these different approaches.
Okay,
thank you.
I would argue that we need both. So I think devolution is a good thing. I think growth strategies at a more local level are a good thing, because local leaders understand the strengths and barriers to investment in their places better sometimes than national level researchers or politicians. But we need both. We need the national level framework, because the UK is a country in the world, and we're talking a lot about.
Okay, no, I've got that point. That's perfect. Sorry, the clock is really against us. Mark, pause.
Yeah, in the same way as Douglas Shannon was asked about services, I want to ask about manufacturing. But I just want to follow up a couple of things that people have said. And Dr. Virdee, you said that the government should be a better customer. Do you mean that it should pay more, an over-competitive price, and what's the consequences of that for competition policy?
No, I don't mean that it should be paying more. I think it should be easier for businesses to receive, for example, an expression of interest or a memorandum of understanding, or for the government to be there as a customer for small businesses. Because
the principle that the government should always buy at the best possible price, you're a better customer, doesn't contravene that principle.
Sorry, could you just clarify?
Yeah. So should the government always buy in its procurement policy at the best possible price, even if that doesn't mean supporting a domestic manufacturer? Or should we pay more?
I think it really depends on the sector and what you're trying to achieve through...
On occasions, government should be prepared to pay more to support a sector of the economy that we want to improve our comparative advantage. Is that what you're saying?
I believe so.
Okay, and if I could come to Raoul, you said that there's no clear sense of lead to achieve the outcomes we want. who defines what the outcomes we want are? Is there a common view about the outcomes we want?
No, look, ultimately, that is where democratically elected government comes in. It's their job to define the outcomes we want, I think. Do
you think that government knows what it wants? Do you think the public knows what it wants? And do you think that our economy, businesses know what government wants?
Well, look, I think we have to try to take a view, and that means bringing the right expertise and right skills together, and taking an understanding also of what voters want and what the country needs. So, look, I think we have to give a best stab at it. It's not an easy thing to come to, but I think having some direction, I think to the point that was made about this piecemeal approach, we do actually provide a lot of support to lots of different sectors at the moment, right? There is a lot of ad hoc work going on, but it's just not coherent, and it's not kind of driven to particular strategies or particular aims. And so I think rationalising that, it's not as if we're not doing any of it now. We do lots of it. I think it's just pulling it under a clearer framework and giving a clearer sense to it as well would be helpful.
Okay, and moving towards manufacturing, you spoke about pharmaceuticals, chemicals and automotive as being areas where, in your words, we'd rested on our laurels. By the expression rested on laurels, you think that means we haven't invested enough, we haven't paid enough attention? What exactly do you mean?
Yeah, so a combination of factors. I think purely, look, my analysis is driven by the trade trends in those areas where our exports have struggled, particularly with certain markets you would think we have good relationships with, like the US. And I think some of that is down to a lack of investment. I think some of it's down to a lack of strategy and thinking about where the areas of development and innovation are going to be in those sectors. And I think some of it is obviously down to some international trends or Brexit, for example, where we have seen disruption. So there are a number of factors that go in different sectors to sector, but I do think at times we've lacked a long-term strategic view of what we want to do in those sectors and where we might be able to compete in the future.
Okay, and many of us want to see a greater share of manufacturing in our economy to provide some balance, and Anna, you spoke about the need for security and resilience in supply chains as being one reason for that. Another one is that manufacturing makes up 50% of our exports, and the average wages in manufacturing are 12% above what they would be in a regional economy. So is the objective that we heard from the Centre for Social Justice to raise manufacturing's contribution from 10% up to 15%, perhaps Anna, is that a reasonable aim? Is it?
Did you say 15?
Yeah, it's from 10 to 15.
Well, that seems like a plausible kind of objective. If we are
implausible.
No, plausible. Because if we
it's a doubling in size.
If we are saying from 10% of value added to 15. Yeah. So I think, if we have strengths, real underlying strengths in advanced manufacturing, we are not realising those necessarily. We do really well on innovation. We really do very well on startups. We're not necessarily doing so well at scaling up the firms to be big employers with value added and productivity here in the UK. So that kind of ambition, given all the resilience and security concerns that we've been discussing, doesn't seem beyond the realms of responsibility. But that's not to say that we won't primarily still be a service-based economy.
Okay, Dr. Virdee, if we're going to do that, we need to get across this valley of death. We've heard from all of our witnesses how good we are in the academic world and in developing ideas, but we're not making them through to manufacturing. I'm very proud that my constituency is home to the Manufacturing Technology Centre, one of the government's catapult centres. What's your assessment of how effective they are at increasing the proportion of our economy in manufacturing?
Well, I think the valley of death is a big problem for a lot of startups, and particularly clean tech startups. And some of the issues that are particularly challenging for them is long-term investment and avoiding market exit or overseas relocation. There's also excessive complexity and administrative burden involved with funding for startups. And
how are the catapults doing in achieving that? They've been around for 10, 12, 15 years. Are we on the right track? Is it having an impact, or is it a waste of money?
I haven't looked into the catapults.
Raoul, what have you got a view about the effectiveness of catapults in taking what you've been speaking about, the innovation that we have, and getting it into volume manufacturing?
I think they can have an effect, and they have been helpful in parts, but I think if we look at kind of the effect that happens in the US in other places, they are more effective in that translation of ideas and research into commercialisation. And part of that might be the role of catapults, but it's also the role of technology transfer offices within universities, and sort of how much equity share they take within startups, how they fund them, and the skills and expertise that are on hand to support the startups. So I think they can have a role, but I also think we need to look at other areas that support the translation of ideas into commercial entities.
Okay. And may I ask each of you about your views on the Advanced Manufacturing Plan, which the government announced last November, committing $4.5 billion to advanced manufacturing. Anna, is that going to be enough?
Well, I think it's a positive step, but it's not necessarily of the scale that we need in terms of resource committed to an industrial or growth strategy. If you look at actual public sector investment as a share of GDP, we've lagged a very long time, and we know there's a key catalytic role for public sector investment, which we need to scale up more than we currently are.
Okay, but I think either you or one of our other witnesses said that there's no way we're ever going to be able to match the size of the stimulus that the Inflation Reduction Act will bring forward, or even the European Union's proposals. By how much should it increase?
Well, I mean, there's the broader point, which I've made in various reports recently, which is that public sector investment matters for growth on infrastructure, on things like R&D, on things like advanced manufacturing plans. And that's where we know for some time we've been of the order of 1% of GDP lower than our main comparators. And we know that there are large-scale growth needs and justifications, and net zero needs to increase that further. 1% of GDP is around 26 billion. I'm not saying that that could be achieved immediately, but we're currently seeing public sector investment falling as a share of GDP over a forecast period. That's the wrong direction of travel.
Okay, thank you.
For R&D, I would just say that although their spending has been increased, 3% would be a good target in my view.
Okay, brilliant. Right, Anthony, final.
Very briefly. The next panel is sitting behind you, so don't let that impact your answers in terms of timing. Dr. Virdee, can we just talk quickly about the comparative technological advantages the UK has on the global scale, and how good are we at seizing those growth opportunities?
I think the UK is not always good at seizing those opportunities, partially because of reasons we mentioned around the technical expertise in government to be able to recognise those opportunities. I think also there's challenges that startup companies face as well. So I think this is something we've broadly covered, unless there was something more to...
Well, the follow-up to this is that we always sort of tout the fact that we're a great place for VC, that we're very good at attracting money into sort of seed companies, all of this side of things, but we're not very good at growing them. You yourself have said exactly the same thing. So, how do we do better in helping British firms scale up? How do we get them to recognise their domestic and international sort of opportunities? And what can government do?
Well, I think the level of funding is certainly something that we have to consider. There's consistency of policy as well, with all the changes we've seen over the last policy strategies. There's been a great deal of policy churn. I don't think any of that has really helped this.
Yeah. And just finally on... You've made a point here about saying where we might be a bit slow to recognise some of the new opportunities that have been presented. A former colleague of ours who, transitioned from a degree in history to a net zero expert produced a report suggesting that, there are huge economic opportunities within the net zero strategy. Do you agree with that? Where do you sort of put the UK's sort of ambitions around net zero?
No, I do agree that net zero has huge economic potential, and the UK is a leader in many areas of green tech. As we've mentioned, carbon capture, usage and storage, offshore wind. These are areas that also generate high spillover. I think these are areas the UK is strong in and can certainly build.
And are we scaling up at a fast enough pace?
I mean, we have been scaling them up, and I think with recent initiatives that have been announced, I think this is we are heading in the right direction.
Finally, just to all three of you, and this is really a sort of one-word answer, if you may, but if you can, which is free trade agreements. Are they helping, the ones that we are signing, in terms of these high-growth sort of sectors that we're looking at exporting? Are they furthering the cause, or are they not getting enough attention in the deals that we're striking?
We'll start with you, Dr. Valero.
I think on manufacturing, we need to make progress with Europe on manufacturing.
Okay. Dr. Virdee?
We're making progress.
Not helping much, but not harming.
Okay, very, very polite. Anna, when you think about the Growth and Productivity Institute, can you pick an institution in UK economic history that is a similar parallel?
Well, we thought something like the Committee on Climate Change, a body that's
So it's not the Board of Trade that Mr. Maglon proposed, it's something like the... Okay.
Like the CCC, but focused on growth and productivity, and indeed working with the CCC to understand where there are synergies and where there are trade-offs.
And can I just check, Raoul, is that idea of an independent growth and productivity commission, is that a good idea?
Yeah, so I think it certainly has merit. I think we do need somewhere within government and within Whitehall that thinks more about growth and productivity rather than purely fiscal and...
Dr. Virdee, a good idea for this sort of institution?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Right, well, look, that's been incredibly useful. I mean, you've basically told us that the sectors that have been listed by the Chancellors are broadly okay, but there are some that are missing, especially in services, but also some strategic spots at global industries where we might have a particular strength. It's obviously important to avoid protectionism, given that we're a medium open economy. You've told us that we are facing competitive pressures globally, which are intensifying. We have lost the edge in some sectors. You've said in answer to Mr. Lavery that there are some policy errors that have made this problem worse. There is some sort of consensus around creating an independent body that could help us coordinate procurement regulations, scaling up investment planning skills and energy. And if that unlocks greater technical expertise in government, that would be a good thing. And there seems to be a strong argument about the need to actually get the order of magnitude of investment scaled up. Even if it's not to 1% of GDP, then perhaps more than it is today. Thank you very much indeed. That's been a flying start. Order. Thank you very much. Thanks so much, everyone.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
5-4.
Order. Welcome to the second panel on today's hearings of the House of Commons Business and Trade Committee and their inquiry into industrial policy. I'd like to start off with a question about your take on the competitive challenges that the UK is facing globally, just to help set the stage. So, Geoffrey, maybe I could start with you. How do you see the pressures on the UK and the competition that we now face getting sharper?
Well, I think they're getting sharper in various ways, not least because the United States and the European Union have been moving strongly in a more industrial policy of an interventionist kind direction, supporting favoured industries with subsidies and other forms of protection. My personal view is that we should be very, very cautious about going down that path, that targeted industrial policy of the sort that the Americans and the Europeans are now adopting has quite high risks, and we should be careful about putting too much reliance on industrial policy as a source of higher productivity, better competitiveness, and so on.
The competitive pressure is going up, you would say, and policy in the United States and Europe, that's ultimately what's responsible.
Well, no, I mean, I think obviously the China factor is a huge factor too, and other so-called developing countries, like Vietnam and so on, are playing an increasing role. So no, it's a global competition. It's just that there have been particular changes, I suppose, in the EU and the US of the sort that I just mentioned, which, well, among other things, have to tremendously increase the attention on industrial policy. And so other countries are wondering, should we be like them or not, and so on. So it's a kind of extra spur.
Perfect. George Dibb, what's your perspective on the competitive challenge?
So I would agree with a lot of what Geoffrey outlined already. I think the competitive pressure has significantly increased internationally, and I certainly wouldn't disagree that the UK taking the same approach is risky, and that we should try and that we should caution. But I would say that we should note that previously competitive pressures have been high because of the rise of China and the developing nations, but it's been a significant shift that comparable developed economies like the European Union and the United States have now stepped up with things like the Green Deal Industrial Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, that means that other countries with similar challenges to the UK are now taking far more ambitious approaches, and I think that the UK has been visibly left behind, and that we should step up to that challenge. So
we'll get into responses in a sec, but we just want to set the stage on what does the pressure look and feel like. But it's a combination of developing countries moving up value chains.
I think there's a longer-term pressure. The much more recent change over the past few years are countries that share the same four challenges as us: the need to shift decisively towards net zero, confront regional inequalities around within a developed economy, the need to restore vitality and growth to the economy, and confront future bottlenecks and geopolitical risks. And the European Union and the US are doing so decisively, and the UK has failed to make similar steps.
Perfect. Giles.
Thank you. I take a rather classical economic approach, which is that despite being a fan of industrial policy, I don't think the problem is other countries getting better at doing things. I think we benefit on the whole when other countries become more productive countries, and our problem is a productivity one. In fact, I think...
But do you think the competitive pressures are getting sharper?
I think probably not. If you compared to the period leading up to 2008, the ability of countries like China to produce things much, much more cheaply was really, really fast then, and we were massive beneficiaries from it as consumers of the stuff they produced, and that was an unacknowledged driver of our prosperity. Now, so another country getting more productive is not necessarily a problem because we can trade with that country and the global division of labour can be fine. The problem, as George has alluded, is we are not making adequate preparations for the changes our economies need to go through, including a lot of difficult investments for, most obviously, net zero. And other countries doing that better leaves us comparatively worse off. But we're not if China becomes much better at producing a lot of global goods, we're not necessarily hurt by that.
That's extremely helpful. Mr. Swinney?
I think I would echo a lot of that. I mean, the position of the UK v other countries in the world is less of my area, but I don't think the challenge has become particularly more acute. I think the challenge for the UK is about how has it become the home, or continue to be the home, for the cutting edge of the economy. You know, the next phase of industries that come about, and it's in a competition with other developed economies. I think that will continue to be the case. And whether that's got sharper or, I don't think it's got weaker, but I also don't think it's necessarily got sharper.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Douglas Chapman.
Yeah, thanks very much. In terms of the industrial strategy, does the government have one? Mr. Owen, sorry.
Well, I think they are doing industrial strategy, if you like. They are intervening in various ways without describing it as part of an industrial strategy. They are subsidising battery plants for electric cars. They're subsidising the Port Talbot steelworks, as you know. So I think, in fact, even though I thought it was rather strange when the Conservative government abandoned the strategy, and whenever it was a couple of years ago, I think that was rather strange, because most of the programmes that Theresa May and Greg Clark started in 2017 have continued. They have continued. They haven't. There may be some changes here and there, but they certainly haven't scrapped them. I mean, the most significant institutional change was the cancelling of the Industrial Strategy Council, which again I thought was a bit strange and couldn't quite understand what the rationale for that was. So there is a sort of industrial strategy going on. I mean, the Chancellor's talked about 5 sectors, 5 important sectors which we should be nurturing and expanding and so on. But there's for some other strange reason a reluctance to use the phrase industrial strategy.
Okay, Ms. Swinney.
So a strategy is something which sets out clear goals and has some actions underneath it as to how to achieve that. I don't see that in any existence within government policy. There is industrial policy, but for me that's not the same as industrial strategy. Might then have differences about what direction I think that strategy should go in, but I don't see any evidence of that strategy being in place in the first place.
Wilkes.
I really welcome your question, because I listed about 30 different individual strategies that the government has that seems to add together to various, from semiconductors, quantum theory, carbon capture and storage. There was a manufacturing plan announced at the beginning of Budget Week last week.
You share that list with us.
I will, but I won't go through the whole thing.
We're super interested to see the list.
The word I would say, and I'm echoing very much what Geoffrey and Paul have said, that they have a furtive strategy, one that sort of is there but they don't like to shout about it, that is in favour of lots of different sectors, and there seems to be a difference of opinion between number 10 and number 11 about whether it's a good thing.
Right. What's the weakness of not having an obvious coherent strategy that you can help things move on? And you mentioned as well earlier just about big issues being productivity and adequate preparation for the future. So would the strategy be part of, would these topics be part of your strategy in your mind of if we were developing one for the UK?
Yes, for certain. And if your question is what's the downside of them doing it in this way, when you talk to industrialists, investment is very difficult. The uncertainty they're most scared of is political uncertainty and lack of commitment and longevity from the political class, which they've seen plenty of in the last decade or so. And the rhetorical commitment to there being an overarching strategy that is agreed upon ideally across the political spectrum makes it a very large difference to industry.
Okay, thank you.
So I would agree very much with others, and we have to go back to the definitions of what we're talking about to answer it really. Industrial policies are individual interventions that seek to shift activity within the economy from one area to another. An industrial strategy is the aggregate of many, many different industrial policies with a strategic aim. And I think that the government has individual industrial policies. For example, full expensing definitely fits that. But I would say it doesn't have an obvious overall strategy. Coming to this point, we've had significant churn on strategy. So IPPR research shows that over the past 14 years, we've had 11 different plans for growth on industrial strategies, along with 9 different business secretaries, 7 different chancellors. And to answer the question of what, I think that presents 2 major challenges. That lack of strategic, vocal direction from the centre presents 2 challenges. The first, as Giles already said, is that we're not giving clear signals of direction of travel to the private sector, which are the ultimate drivers of our extremely low private sector investment in the UK. And secondly, maybe we pay less attention to, but is very important, is coordination within Whitehall. So the ability of different departments to understand what the centre wants and to get in line with those overall strategic priorities.
Thank you very much. Just in terms of the way forward, and if we were designing or looking at industrial strategy for the UK in the future, I mean, you've mentioned a couple of solutions there and things you would like to see. Sir Geoffrey, if you were picking maybe a few things that you would recommend or make a recommendation to the government on, you need these elements within your industrial strategy. What do you think they might be?
Well, I'm a bit dubious about the concept of an overarching industrial strategy into which all kinds of individual decisions can be fitted. I think, although I'm in general sceptical about industry-specific intervention on the basis of past experience, there certainly are areas where the government can and should intervene. I mean, I think an interesting case, which you may want to deal with separately, I don't know, is the steel industry, which is not... is that a... First of all, there's a question, is it a strategic industry? What does strategic mean in this context? And then, in looking at what the government has done, they seem to have focused very strongly on decarbonising the early stages of the steelmaking process. And that is obviously, there's a strong case for that. It's a big carbon emitter and so on. But another ingredient in the steel case, which probably applies to other industries, is the relevance of national security. Is it important for national defence, national security, that we should have a strong steel industry, and it should be strong in all phases, from the sort of iron-making end down to the finishing end, or what? And I think the national security angle is quite an important one in thinking about industrial policy. For example, it's not just the front end, the steel making, but all these rolling and finishing mills. Do we have gaps in our range of steel making capacities which are dangerous from a defence point of view? And if so, what can the government do to fill those gaps? I mean, there was a case, one more. There was a case a couple of years ago, you may remember, when Sheffield Forgemasters, a steel company in the north, was taken over by the government because that particular company was the more or less sole producer of specialised forgings for nuclear submarines. Well, that was a kind of special case. But I think the national security argument needs to be, if that's a reason for defending the steel industry or protecting the steel industry, it needs to be set out and explained.
Right. Mr. Swinney, anything you would add to the list of things you would take to number 10?
So I think you do want to, again, you do want a strategy which then guides private sector parts of Whitehall, but also I think between the different guides local as well, about what is that local areas are trying to achieve within the nature of the national economy, and so that's helpful in that respect. I think my position though in terms of what the industrial strategy should do is it should focus much more about the roles that different places play in the national economy rather than focusing too much on sectors, because I'm sceptical about the ability of policymakers to pick out what the growth sector is going to be in 10 or 20 years' time. And then even if we do identify those sectors, I'm not entirely clear what it is, how policy will be different as a result. So if it is, my view would be moving into ever more knowledge-based type activity. Those types of activities will require access to lots of skilled workers, access to appropriate commercial space, and probably access to good public transport, or to good transport to link those workers to the jobs. That's much more about getting the benefits right for getting those companies to come to invest in particular places, rather than it being it's going to be sector X and it's going to be sector Y.
Okay, so if we had something like that, we could virtually do away with levelling up entirely, because it would happen as a matter of course, with your view. Mr. Rhodes, finally, do you want to add anything to the...
one element I'm slightly biased in favour of is that the government should commit to grand challenges. In other words, areas which we know the economy and society are going to change over the next 20, 30, 40 years. This was something we started under the Theresa May government. Net zero, the changing in the way we transport ourselves, the ageing economy, and quantum and artificial intelligence and big data. These are areas where you don't have to be Mystic Meg to know that the world is changing in that direction, and therefore commitment is credible. I would say also we need to be thinking very hard about the issues raised by Lord Richard Harrington, that excellent recent report about the difficulty of engaging with the government. For people on the outside, knowing who to speak to is confronting a labyrinth, and that is because most good ideas in industrial intervention bubble up from the outside. We're failing to take them by being so impenetrable. And finally, I'd say they need to focus on the question of civil service capacity for the very issues that Geoffrey illustrated earlier, that national security and other difficult trade-offs require real expertise to finesse, and it's not a simple matter of just making or trading, and you really do need adequately paid civil servants who've got real longevity in their role to be able to help you with those.
Okay, thank you. As you can tell, as you may have spotted on this panel, what we are trying to really get to the bottom of is the right balance between horizontal policy, vertical policy and spatial policy. And Mr. Pawsey is now going to prosecute the questioning.
Well, I was going to go to Sir Geoffrey, if I might, in the first place, because you posed a whole series of questions about, whether national security was important. And with the greatest respect, as a witness on our giving evidence to the committee, we were hoping you'd give us answers rather than questions. So, how important is national security, for example, in respect of the steel industry, in ensuring that we've got a foundation industry to support other industries?
Well, I haven't got an answer. All I would say is that decarbonising Port Talbot is only one element in thinking about how we protect or preserve a steel industry. I mean, the steel is a globally traded commodity, and we're heavily dependent on imports from other parts of Europe and elsewhere. I think the issue, and I think it's a very difficult one, and relates to supply chains more generally, is how self-sufficient do we want to be, and in what areas? Obviously we can't be totally self-sufficient in all branches of the steel industry, but it may be that there are certain products that have a particular defence-related component, such as heavy plate making or something of that sort, where we, for various reasons, our capacity has been reduced very sharply in recent years, and maybe we should think about how what could be done about that.
Right, well, you're suggesting we think about these things without really giving us a suggestion of where you and your organisation might sit in terms of making those decisions.
As I said, I in general am much more keen on horizontal, non-sector specific policies than vertical ones, but I think one can point to some areas where, for example, national security is involved, or where net zero is involved, where some direct intervention by the state is helpful.
And George Dibb, you told us that a strategy was a series of policies come together. We've set out a clear strategy in respect to policy, forgive me, in respect to the steel industry. We've decided that we do need to be producing steel in the UK. How should that manifest itself? What should government do to build that into a broader strategy?
So I don't think we should present vertical and horizontal industrial strategies as an either or. We can do both. So going back to kind of the previous question about what we would propose if we want to do an industrial strategy, between the four of us we kind of reconstructed the 2017 Greg Clark industrial strategy. It did foundations, it looked at skills, it was place-based, and it had grand challenges within it. Now, to achieve those things, you're going to need both horizontal and vertical. So you can't launch a moonshot unless you have a solid foundation to launch from. So yes, we need to nail the kind of overall economic conditions, things like barriers to trade, fundamental skills. We need to get the governance in place too, but we also should take, in our opinion, a market shaping rather than a market fixing approach. So instead of trying to identify individual market failures, we should recognise that no bit of the economy really exists without interacting with or touching the state through regulation or whatever it might be, and that if we're going to try and shift those sectors over the long term, we want all of those directions, all of those indicators or things pointing in the same strategic direction. So we would then kind of focus on two sides of what actually shapes a market, on the production side and on the purchasing side. And on both of those, there are international examples and a strong evidence base of interventions that you could take.
And how about what the UK has done in the past? Have we previously, in recent years, have we got that right, or has the markets simply been in our favour, or is it a legacy that we were early starters and everybody's now caught up?
I think there are good examples of where we've done both. So the success of the installation of offshore wind was undoubtedly a success of industrial policy. That was entirely through interventions on the purchasing side. Well, not entirely, but largely through intervention on the purchasing side through contracts for difference. We did not take the same approach on the production side to ensure that we captured the economic upside of that manufacturing commensurate to the installation capacity. On the other hand, with the COVID-19 vaccine and AstraZeneca during the pandemic, the UK government did take a really strategic approach on both sides through being, as we heard on the previous panel, a good customer, a strategic customer, putting in place purchase guarantees.
Giles, we've just heard from George about how we demand created the product was developed, but it wasn't manufactured in the UK. Why did that go wrong, and how can we intervene better to prevent an equivalent on wind turbines happening on other sectors?
First, if I may slightly question the premise that there are 20,000 jobs potentially that we may have gained if we had entirely been able to internalise the supply chains of offshore wind, which would have been lovely, but still the most important thing about the offshore wind is us getting the renewable energy into this country. And if the choice that was being confronted at the time, I was in government for some of this, would have been, in effect, to charge consumers slightly more in order that the production should be here. And the invisibility of that trade-off would have been something that would have bothered the Treasury quite rightly.
Why would it have needed to cost consumers more if we'd managed just simply to make land available, to improve the planning process, to provide better foresight about the demand, to encourage manufacturers to make those turbines here rather than import them from elsewhere?
To be fair, some of that was done, hence the Siemens plant in Hull, which were a lot of those activities took place, and as a result there is a decent facility at Hull doing that. But the reason would have been, I suppose, that a very straightforward vanilla auction process would have looked at the cheapest one available at the time, and as you'll recall, the prices of offshore wind was absolutely dropping very, very hard. And I suppose the advice would have been, if you stopped and said, well, hold it a mo, are you also going to guarantee local supply? They might have said yes, but we're going to need a little help financially. I can only speculate as to how much more. And ideally, of course, you get the best of all worlds and you somehow make the best place in the world to do it the UK. I'm just saying it would not have been the conservative assumption that we'd necessarily have achieved that.
Okay. And so, Geoffrey, if I come to you, you have spoken about the ability of governments to predict which industries will grow and prosper is limited. So if the government can't do that, why should it have a policy or a strategy at all?
Well, it certainly has a strategy, if we want to use the term, for research and development. And in deciding on where funds for basic research or applied research should be carried out, it has to take a view about which technologies look like being...
Why should the government do that rather than relying on the market to do it?
Well, I think it's a great... We can't do everything. And for example, if you take an industry like semiconductors, for various reasons, we have a rather small semiconductor industry and not very much in the way of manufacturing. And the overwhelming strength of that industry is in Asia, with Taiwan and so on. And so it seems...
But so, Geoffrey, many of those semiconductors that are being manufactured in Taiwan and Asia were developed here. Why didn't we take the ideas and get through that valley of death to manufacturing here?
Well, I think it's a complicated story which applies as much to other European countries as well as the UK. I mean, America was a leader for a while, Japan was a leader, and now the Taiwanese and South Koreans are strong. I mean, it's the way... I don't think you can point to any one particular government mistake or whatever. And I mean, as I think you're aware of, it's interesting that we do have a world leader in the semiconductor industry in the form of ARM. And as my understanding of the history, that cannot be attributed to industrial policy. It was an entrepreneurial effort by people in Cambridge and elsewhere to develop this technology. Of course, they benefited from wider policies, the strength of Cambridge University in relevant scientific research and so on. But nobody predicted that ARM would become a hugely important player in the world semiconductor industry. So one should be wary, I think, that's all I'm saying, of predicting this is the industry we should be.
And Paul Swinney, do you think it's the role of government to identify winners and back them, or should we leave that to the market?
I think it's I'm concerned, again, it's difficult to pick out what those sectors are going to be in 10, 15, 20 years' time. And I'm also There will be differences in policy, the approach we take, but in general, I think the policy approach would be fairly similar. It is about those horizontals in particular. So if we think about the semiconductor industry, or we think about wind turbines or renewable generation, the challenge and the competition for the UK is not about the manufacturing of those things, which the UK is just not as well placed to do because it is a higher cost place to do that relative to the Far East, for example. The challenge is about how to try and get the high value stuff in. So if the high value element of chip development is happening in the UK and the production is happening elsewhere, I think we should be less concerned about that. In the same way, if you look at wind turbine development and production, yes, we've got the Siemens plant in Hull, which is good for Hull from a jobs perspective, but as my understanding of it is that the design of those doesn't happen in Hull, the design of those happens in Manchester, and that partly explains why Manchester is now increasingly doing better than a place like Hull, because it's capturing that high value stuff, and that's where I think we should be focusing on, which for me is about thinking much more about the horizontals and the spatial as opposed to trying to pick out individual sectors.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Right, we're going to play a little game now. So it's budget 2025, and I'm basically going to give you all £100, and you've got to make a choice about what fraction of that £100 to spend on horizontal strategies, what to spend on vertical or market shaping strategies, and what to spend on spatial strategies. And then Mr. Magnall's going to come in and test your answers. So just indulge the game for a sec, because I just want to try and tease out where the differences are.
I have to indulge it rather than questioning the premise that there's a separation between spatial policy.
I appreciate you're an economist, but just...
So between the three categories? There's spatial...
Horizontal, vertical and spatial.
All right, I'd put £10 of my 100 on horizontal policies because I think we've got the broad shape of that quite well. I think we need to probably invest a bit more in infrastructure. Say 20 because it makes the maths easier, and then 40 on the other two. We need to...
40 on the other two, okay. That's you.
I think we need to really put the strength...
We'll do it around. Giles?
I would put half of it into spatial policies, specifically for mayors to try to increase the size of their travel to work areas. I suspect I'm stealing something off Paul's expertise.
that's fine.
I would actually put
market between the four of you. So
I would actually put the other half straight into civil service capacity, which I guess is market shaping, the regulatory capacity in particular that too slow moving.
Arguably, that's horizontal because it would support. Okay, we can argue the toss. Paul.
I think I would do 10% vertical. I think there'll be some elements probably where you can do a little bit around the edges, particularly if we think about sort of mission-based and trying to change the nature of the economy as opposed to picking out individual sectors. So some money to go there. And so the split, or the rest of it, is between horizontal and spatial. Some of that, as George says, I think there's a bit of overlap there. I think ultimately the horizontal is probably the most important. So I go 50, but then I go close behind with spatial at 40.
Very good. Okay, so Geoffrey.
I would go for 70% on horizontal and split the other lot, maybe 2 15s or something of that sort. But I think that this place-based strategies have a very close link with national strategies. I mean, just to mention one example, South Wales has a promising compound semiconductor sector, which is not competitive with Taiwan, not trying to do the same things as Taiwan, but looks as though it might be quite promising. And I think the Welsh government has been quite active in supporting that sector. But it also, if it's going to flourish, it does have to have some substantial support from central government, partly from UKRI, the research agency, and partly in other ways. So the 2 15s sort of overlap into each other.
Yeah. Okay. I'll come back to some of those differences. Mr. Magnall.
Thank you very much, Chair.
You'll have noticed there was quite a lot of money there going into the spatial.
I have noticed. I've made notes about it as well. I'm wondering actually if we could start with you, Dr. Dibbs, which is, how should government choose which sectors to support then?
So I think we heard in the last session again some of the evidence. There's a growing evidence base out there that actually the UK does have some quite strong existing manufacturing strengths, at least in green sectors. So my answer here will probably be largely focused on green sectors, because that's where a lot of our recent work has been focused. And I would say the approach can probably be spread out a bit more broadly. So we have to come up with 3 different broad categories, I think. So firstly, areas where we are currently strong and we just need further support. Across forthcoming work from IPPR shows that across green manufacturing products, the UK already has comparative advantage in about a third of those. Then I'd say there's a second category of things where we should seek to be good in the future based on a strategic choice. And I would say, for example, one of those areas 10, 20 years ago would have been offshore wind. We could have looked at the geographical characteristics of the UK and said, well, this is obviously going to be an important area for us. And then thirdly, there are probably going to be sectors which will require long-term support, which may never be cost competitive with other countries, but we might want them here for reasons of national security or resilience. Now, I think each of those will require different kind of policies to support them, and we should be clear about why we're seeking to support a sector. But really, I think it also goes to a point that Giles made earlier around state capacity. We don't have a huge amount of this evidence base, a rigorous evidence base in the UK to make those decisions, and I think we need that. So I think we do need to expand state capacity and decision-making, as well as frameworks of how we make decision-making, going beyond things like static cost-benefit analysis to allow us to actually make strategic choices.
Thank you for that. I mean, I'm keen to get a better understanding of what you think the government's sort of criteria should be. I'm interested in the fact that PwC set out a number of they set out a number of targets for the strategy, which was that, there should be genuine comparative advantage, there should be significant long-term growth, there should be an important contribution to economic security, help to address priorities for inclusive growth. I recognise that some will agree with that and others will disagree with that, but also that you then have the UK Trade Policy Observatory who are making a point about directly addressing market failures, and the most efficient market policy is one that addresses those failures. So with what you just said, how do you set out what a criteria would be for a government to try and implement something that would end up being successful? And then I'm going to come to you, Sir Geoffrey.
I would really push back against the idea that we should only seek to be good in areas where we currently have comparative advantage. That is not how other countries have developed. The UK's diversity of exports and industrial strengths has declined, whereas other countries in the G7 and OECD have increased. And we know, if we're thinking about an industrial strategy to get us to net zero, a lot of the areas that we're going to need to be strong in, firstly, nobody has comparative advantage in them because nobody's making them at the moment. But we know we're going to need those products in the future. So there's a real market opportunity that we could seek to capitalise on. But that's not solely seeking to be good in areas where we currently have comparative advantage.
Geoffrey.
Well, I think this whole question of choice is absolutely fundamental. How does government choose a sector? And I think an interesting case, which is worth mentioning for a couple of seconds, is the question of batteries for electric cars. Yeah. Now, what I think was interesting about that was in 2017, when the Faraday programme was launched, Sir Mark Walport, who was then the chief scientific advisor, wrote a rather complete sort of prospectus for why it was important for the UK to do something in batteries for electric cars, where our position was weak. And he set out quite some detail, most of which was implemented, a set of steps which the government should initiate in order to make the UK a more attractive place for investing in battery-related technologies and so on. And if I could just mention one thing about that, which I'd like to emphasise, nobody knows whether that programme has been successful or not. Was the Walport prospectus, has it worked? Or which bits of it have worked and which have been less successful? What can we learn from it? And what was interesting about it, relating to the, as it were, creation of new industries or hardly developed industries, was that he set out a kind of coordinated approach, starting from basic research through Innovate UK for applying the research, and then on to the car makers who actually use the batteries. And he presented it, and I think probably Greg Clark agreed with it, as a sort of model that could be applied to other industries where we're starting something relatively new. And what I would like to see, maybe it's something that outsiders should do, I don't know, is some assessment of what worked and what didn't work.
I mean, your approach is obviously a much broader one. It's not asking government to pick winners and losers. It's trying to set the land, set the environment for one that can allow businesses of all sort of types, colours, interests thrive and succeed. What measures are you saying that government should introduce? I mean, we have seen a few over the last few years around capital allowance, trying to attract sort of better investment or reinvestment. What would you like to, if you could click your fingers tomorrow and be in charge, what would you like government to do? What would you do?
Well, I'm not sure if I've got a very clear answer, but I think the whole question of the financing of growing companies is a big issue, and it has been a big concern for successive governments, and we haven't really cracked it. We, as somebody's mentioned earlier, we have quite a successful record of starting firms, but they tend to get bought up or don't grow into big ones. And maybe there are some weaknesses in the city and the way the stock market is organised and so on, which could be put right with government help. So I would think that financing area is one which I would put quite a lot of emphasis on.
Okay. Thank you. Finally, Mr. Lavery.
Mr. Wilkes, you were a special advisor to Theresa May. And I think before that, Vince Cable as well on industrial economic policy. I wonder if you could just explain to the committee what the strengths and the weaknesses were of the industrial strategy in 2017.
I think it now, in retrospect, looks like a pretty decent attempt. I would say this as one of the people behind the scenes pushing away at it. I would say, and also partially as a reflection of the earlier question from Mr. Magnall about how you choose. I think we had a relatively sober set of criteria that meant we had targets that were relatively easy to stick to. I would have answered, is the direction of travel of the economy clear in this area? Do we have some kind of long-term advantages? Are they all long-term investment sorts of areas of the economy where you have to make commitments that last for a long time? And I think in many ways both of those strategies had a kind of reasonable approach to all of those and would have presented targets that people would have kept to. The biggest weakness of both was undoubtedly intra-Whitehall, in that you cannot have a successful industrial strategy if you do not have every part of government kind of believing in it. And although we tried to do that in the slightly sort of centralising, imperious way at Downing Street will, which is telling people this is your policy, announcing speeches and sort of muttering darkly if they don't help, there wasn't anything like the same ownership. I mean, at some point to go through speeches from the Treasury and look up the phrase industrial strategy and see how often they mention it in their keynote speeches. I suspect the answer was very little, despite the fact that at the outset of the Theresa May government, in the form of the National Productivity Investment Fund, Philip Hammond announced a really quite handsome sum of money that could have been used for it. There was an unwillingness to get behind it, and a lot of industrial strategy requires different departments to resolve real differences of opinion about serious matters like the planning or national security. And if you just leave it to over-promoted special advisors like me to go around trying to fix it, you'll have the success you see. So it needs to have consistent high-level ownership across the cabinet and a willingness to deal with the inevitable siloisation, if that's a phrase, that happens in government when they're trying to pursue cross-governmental aims.
As you've just said, you're the main weakness.
Oh, I'm here to apologise.
Only just. Maybe a slightly controversial question is Boris Johnson versus Theresa May. Because Boris Mr. Johnson replaced the 2017 industrial strategy with the plan for growth. And looking back, was that the right thing to do? Was it more beneficial? Or do you think that perhaps we should have stuck with Theresa May's approach, which you've just basically outlined? Perhaps each individual would give like a very brief answer to that, but Giles, perhaps you want to...
I'll say it was a mistake, because the plan for growth in appearance was a ring round of Whitehall. What are you all doing that we can stick into our various chapters? And then was published quite quickly. It was not a preconceived strategy, and the industrial strategy was at least an attempt to be one. So my bias is clear.
I would agree with that. I think that for all the weaknesses that the 2017 strategy had, it was, I think, the best and closest approach that the UK's had to a serious industrial strategy in some time, and the replacement of it with the plan for growth with a serious rollback. Some IPPR research of civil service staff numbers at the time showed that the replacement of the industrial strategy with the plan for growth involved the scrapping of a 50 to 70 person industrial strategy directorate within the business department and replacing it with 0.5 full-time equivalents, so half a person within the Treasury. And that's because the Treasury saw the plan for growth as a single one-off project, a thing to pull together priorities and put it out there in a PDF, rather than an ongoing programme of seeking to shape the economy. It also involved the scrapping of significant oversight and governance bodies like the Industrial Strategy Council. It really was a terrible mistake.
So, Geoffrey?
Well, I think two things. One, I think Boris Johnson was instinctively a strong interventionist. He wanted to create world-leading companies. And I've heard it said, but I'm not saying this is correct at all, that if Boris had still been around, the battery company called British Volt, which seemed for a short period to be a kind of great hope for the future, would have survived. Now, I don't know if that's right, but I think his instincts were quite strongly interventionist. I think as far as the cancellation of the strategy is concerned, I saw that as a purely political decision. It was something that Mrs May had done. We're different. We're a different sort of government, and we don't need it anymore. I think it was a mistake. Maybe it could have been modified in some way. I think it was a bigger mistake to scrap the Andy Haldane's Industrial Strategy Council, which I think was doing quite useful work. So I think it was a sort of a political error.
Mr. Swinney?
The constant churn of policy in this area is the big challenge. There may be issues around the specifics on what the 2017 strategy looked like. For me, probably two sector focused within it. But if you're going to do these sorts of things, it's got to be credible and it's got to be long term. And just that it can just be dropped just like that for a PDF basically shows how little weight these types of things have. And if these strategies are supposed to be getting private sector, different parts of Whitehall together, national and local together, uniting behind one thing to tackle challenges which are, decades-long challenges. If actually people think that we scrapped the next government or the next change of leadership, there's no credibility there, and that I think is the more fundamental problem that we need to be thinking about.
Thanks.
Right, thank you very much. Now, Giles, you spent half of your money on something called capacity building in government, and your institute produced quite an interesting report yesterday about centre of government and its role in all of this. What would you like to get out of all of this money that you've just spent on capacity building? Like, how many people are we talking about?
I am very much influenced by the work of better researchers than me on questions like the lack of responsiveness of our regulators, for example. There was an excellent recent piece by Peter Foster of the Financial Times about the lost opportunities of Brexit, which was a surprising one given his normal stance.
But if we're trying to improve technical expertise of government to make better policy decisions, I mean, are we talking an influx of 10 people or 1,000 people? What's your perception on the capacity?
I think we're probably talking hundreds, if anything. I think somewhere around, I've heard, for example, that Treasury numbers have increased by 1,000 or so from the sort of low numbers of thousands that they normally have, largely in response to new requests like economic security ones. I think those sorts of numbers are all you need. If you think that we're trying to replicate some of the skill set you have in consultancies will have a few dozen people able to master a sector and advise on it, and it shouldn't be very much more than that.
We're talking about 60 million quid in resource cost.
Yeah, not very much.
Not a big number, okay. And you will have heard Dr. Valero rehearse the argument this morning for an independent growth and productivity commission, something that is a bit more permanent as an institution. Is that a good idea? Is that sort of idea a good thing?
On balance, although I worry that, and nostalgia for what was a really excellent Industrial Strategy Council can make people too optimistic about what these can achieve, in that people hope that they can have the same effect on policy as the OBR and the Bank of England has on fiscal and monetary policy, whereby they provide a kind of level of credibility and long-term commitment that almost takes it away from politicians. I don't think in industrial strategy you can do that. Industrial strategy is too inherently political in every way. The Industrial Strategy Council and the sorts of things you just referred to, Chair, are great because they could greatly improve our analytical capacity, which is often far too speculative and grabbing from this think tank or that think tank. And that would be great to guide policy, but it will not take away the sort of really difficult commitment issues. It won't be a...
Okay, but is there a case then for some kind of epicentre where some of these decisions are coming together?
Yes, I do think so, yes.
George, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I'll not touch on whether inflation is political or not. I think so. Lots of things that are political in the economy are kind of farmed out to these outside bodies. I think the Industrial Strategy Council, I think Giles is right that nostalgia is maybe quite strong for it. I think we needed something in that space, but its mandate was extremely weak. Yeah. The mandate that Theresa May and Greg Clark gave it was only to set.
There is a role for institution.
Yeah, there is, and I think and I would say that looking at things like the Climate Change Committee, an independent statutory authority that also has a strong secretariat that can do independent research, is the kind of direction that I would say.
Paul, is that an idea you'd support?
I'm not really sure what it is it would do.
Fine. Sir Geoffrey?
I'm very much against institutional tinkering or tinkering with institutions, and I think the Industrial Strategy Council had a relatively narrow focus, and that was good. That was good. It was there for a particular reason, and it did useful work. For example, looking at the whole vaccine development, what could we learn from that? Was this a good example of industrial policy, and so on? I think, as far as possible, we should avoid, constantly tearing up one institution and putting another one. I'm a bit uneasy about the broad scope that is being envisaged for the proposal you just mentioned.
Yeah, right, thank you. That brings us to a conclusion of what's been an absolutely brilliant discussion. Thank you very much indeed. So I think what you've basically told us is the competitive pressures are increasing, but that could be as much about others preparing for the future faster. Today, you've described more a bag of policies than a strategy. We've had a really useful conversation about the balance between horizontal, vertical and spatial. I think it's fair to say the average across your answers would put about half of the money into horizontal, with spatial not far behind, vertical perhaps in third place, but with some very clear arguments for it, not least market shaping, policy, national security overrides. And Sir Geoffrey, you made the valuable point that in R&D strategy we do make these choices already. And I think there's been a pretty broad consensus about the need for some kind of institution and better models for decision-taking and evaluation. So you've been tremendous witnesses, and you've given us a really useful scheme of evidence for our inquiry. Thank you very much indeed. This concludes this panel. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.